The story of the Annunciation to Joseph comes in the first chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew. Now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they had lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to dismiss her and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what has been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise be to you, O Christ. In the 7th chapter of the book of the prophet Isaiah, and in the 1st chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew, we meet two men. One is a king, the other is a carpenter. One commands armies, the other works with his hands. On the shoulders of one rests the future of a nation, and on the shoulders of the other, if you believe the story, rests the future of all humanity. Neither of these men knew the other. In fact, they lived some 8 centuries apart. But whenever the church tells the story of the incarnation, these men and their stories are linked together. What keeps these stories of these two men linked to one another, and what keeps us linked to them, is a promise from God. How each man responded to that promise tells us a lot about that person and a lot about us. So on this 4th Sunday of Advent, as the Advent clock ticks off the final few hours, I invite you to ignore the chaos in the spare room this morning. Forget trying right now to find all those gifts you laid away in a good, safe place last summer during the summer sales. And by all means, ignore any tweets which originate from Washington, D.C. And attend this morning to the story of these two men. King Ahaz is worried, and rightly so. Two nations to the north, Syria and Israel, have joined forces against his tiny nation of Judah because he won't join them in their rebellion against Assyria. Judah is no match for these two nations. Isaiah says that the heart of Ahaz trembled and shook like the trees of the forest, which shake before the wind. It's a telling metaphor for people who live in Tree Town. We know what that's like. As Ahaz peeks over the walls to see the enemy encamped around Jerusalem, the prophet Isaiah appears in court with an alternative national security policy. Trust in the Lord, Isaiah tells the king. This crisis will pass. Remember that you are a king in the line of David, and God has promised that a king in the line of David will sit upon the throne. You are a messianic king, so act like it. If you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all. Right, sure, that's all Ahaz needs right now. Here he is, his capital besieged, his food running low. He's down to his last tin of sardines, and this prophet appears to tell him to sit tight and just have faith. Just imagine how that would go over in the polls if he were to announce that this is his new defense policy. Forget the next generation of high-tech weaponry. Cancel the orders for the Exocet spears and for the Bradley chariots. Just trust in the Lord. Isaiah can see his message is not being very well received. If you don't trust my word, he says, well then ask for proof. Ask a sign of the Lord your God, be it as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. The king's response sounds religiously correct, but it's just a guise to keep him from acknowledging that faith in God might have anything to do with national foreign policy. I will not put the Lord to the test, he says. I'll tell you, nothing makes preachers madder than politicians who know how to sound religious without taking any religious risk themselves. I will not put the Lord to the test. I am in favor of prayer in public schools. My favorite book of the Bible is 2 Corinthians. It's all about appearing religiously sincere. But Isaiah, he knows a phony when he hears one. All right, he says to Ahaz, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and will bear a son, and you shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey like any baby being weaned, and before he gets old enough to spot a fake like you from the real McCoy, before the child knows how to refuse evil and choose the good, the land before whose kings you are in dread will be deserted. Before the pious posturing of a leader whose ego has no limits, in the face of genuine threat and foolish attempts at autonomy, Isaiah gives us the promise of a little baby born of a young woman, a baby whose name embodies the prophetic promise, Emmanuel, which means God with us. Well, as it turned out, Isaiah was right. The crisis of that moment did pass, and Jerusalem was spared invasion, at least for the time being. But King Ahaz had made his choice. He was going to make it on his own. He was not about to risk his future and the future of his nation on the promise of a little baby named Emmanuel. The stakes for Joseph, who lived some 800 years later, seem on the surface to have been a lot lower. He was just a carpenter from the crossroad town of Nazareth. He didn't command any armies or sit on any thrones. I like to imagine he sat on a chair that he made himself, and that he slept in a bed that had been ordered by a customer, but the customer had canceled the order, so Joseph just kept sleeping in that bed. He was hoping, though, to start a family soon. He was betrothed to a little slip of a girl named Mary, whom he hardly knew. That's the way it worked in those days. A word with the matchmaker, a settlement on the dowry, and you're practically a married man. One thing we do not have to imagine about Joseph, we know he was an honorable man, a righteous man. It must have come as quite a blow to him to discover that Mary was pregnant. The gossips in Nazareth had already gone to work. He could feel the eyes on his back as he walked down the street. He could hear the whisperings of the women at the well when he passed by. Barely betrothed, already a cuckold. The shame must have been for Joseph unbearable. By rights, he could have made a public example of Mary. Technically, he could have had her stoned. But he was an honorable man, a righteous man, and he was unwilling to expose her to public disgrace. So he had resolved to dismiss her quietly. How different he was from his ancestor Ahaz, who made such a public display of his purported piety. Then came the word from the Lord. Not in the person of a prophet this time, but in the form of an angel in a dream, who must have been more impressive to look at than Isaiah, but had a message no less preposterous. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Yeshua, Jesus, he who saves, for he will save his people from their sins. That's the word of the angel. And then comes in the text the word of Matthew, which links these stories of Ahaz and of Joseph. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Lo, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. The message once delivered to a king who had the power to wage war is now delivered to a carpenter who has the power merely to destroy a young woman's life. Don't be afraid. God is in this. No matter how many troops are arrayed outside the city walls, no matter how frightened or inadequate or hurt you feel, no matter what common sense and even common decency may dictate, trust the promise. For the centuries, the church has become focused on the difference between the Hebrew version, which uses this word translated young woman, and the Greek version of the promise, which uses a word translated virgin. But debate over that word is missing the point. The most miraculous and offensive word in this prophecy is that name, Emmanuel. That's the word upon which the truth of the incarnation hangs. That's the miracle of Christmas. That's the word we've been waiting to hear in Advent, and the word the whole of humanity longs to hear. With the troops outside the city walls, with the presidential impeachment pot about to boil over, with our own hearts pounding as we realize that we are not in control. We are not the masters. Even our kings and our presidents cannot make us safe. We hear the news that is almost too good to be true. God has come as Emmanuel. God is with us. We are not alone. The sign of the child Emmanuel is not enough for Ahaz. He wants something more concrete, something more certain. And he finds it for a while in the mighty Assyrian army, but even that gives way to the superior forces of Babylon. We will never find security in power. We can fill our dresser drawers with handguns. We can barricade our homes. We can build a wall along the border. We can close our churches from the people who come off the streets, but we will never find security until we embrace the helpless child who comes unprotected to live among us. Only He can save us from the pretense of self-reliance. Only He sees through the veneer of our public piety. Only He can teach us how to live in faith. It was Joseph the carpenter, not Ahaz the king, who seems to have understood all of this. Or if he did not understand it all, at least he was willing to take the risk. He took Mary as his wife with all her accompanying liabilities. He hitched his wagon to a promise made to him in a dream. He went where monarchs and wise ones would never dare to go. He went from Advent into Christmas, where God had promised to be with him as Emmanuel. This week we journey along with Joseph to receive a familiar promise. We've heard it before because God has been making it for centuries. It is the promise of the child born to Joseph and Mary, far from princely palaces. There in Bethlehem, the city of David, we shall find him. He is the child of God's promise, the one in whom true security dwells. He is Emmanuel, God with us, the sign of God's ancient promise, as deep as hell and as high as heaven. To him we come on Tuesday night, on our Advent journey as it ends. To him we bring the hopes and fears of all the years. Don't be afraid. Emmanuel is coming. Emmanuel is here. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.